This is a review of the 1967 John Boorman film Point Blank, which stars Lee Marvin, Angie Dickinson, Keenan Wynn, and Carol O'Connor, also known as Archie Bunker. To some, this is a disorienting movie. I almost watched this movie incorrectly. I actually started this movie once, thought I was too tired to really follow what was going on, and came back to it another time. And when I came back to it the second time, I, again, almost went down completely the wrong path about what this movie is about and the best way to watch it. Like I said, this is a disorienting movie. Orienting yourself in a movie is something I think is an important skill to develop as you watch more and more things. And as you watch movies that are farther and farther away from the mainstream, that have fewer obvious signposts about how it is, about how you should watch them, where the cultural and historical context might not be your immediate present, might not be things that you're used to. Being able to orient yourself in a movie is important. What does that mean? I mean, one basic example, for instance, is figuring out how much you should pay attention to the plot. There are some movies that are thrillers or horror movies, tricky movies, mysteries, where you should be looking at the details. You should be remembering everything that people say. You should be piecing everything together. You should see the gun on the wall in the first act and think about who's going to get shot. That's part of the fun of the mystery, is trying to solve the mystery. It's part of the fun of watching a horror movie, is to be paranoid, right? It's to be considering all the things that could go wrong. It's to think about places where people could jump out from, things like that. There are other movies where noting down details like this might be an enormous mistake. Movies where there is sort of a different type of content, something more thematic, something more intellectual, that's working much more abstractly, right? A good example of this, for instance, is the Korean film Burning. This is a movie that sort of masquerades as a murder mystery, but if you spend your time trying to piece together the whodunit, you've completely missed the point of a movie that has much more to do with how meaning-making differs between different classes, which is more about what I think that movie's about. You might look at some of David Lynch's films as well. If you're sitting watching Mulholland Drive and trying to make an Excel spreadsheet about all the different versions of each character and piecing together exactly what's going on, you're probably not going to get the most out of it. Of course, there's no wrong way necessarily to watch a movie, I guess, but I think there are certain things, there are certain approaches that will be more rewarding. For older movies, a good example is that you might find yourself rooting for the wrong character if you don't understand sort of the moral context of the times. In some ways, you might be put off by something that it turns out that the movie's protagonist might do things that put you off, and you might not support the protagonist, and you'll get a very different experience than people would have gotten at the time, and than the director would have intended. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can't enjoy the movie, that you can't be interested in it, but like I said, when you get farther and farther away from your present mainstream context, the things you're primed to pick out and watch, it takes more work. This movie is disorienting, and it almost completely threw me for a loop. The beginning of this movie is literally quite disorienting. It's a lot of fast cuts between seemingly disjoint plot lines, a lot of different images, very interesting sound design throughout this movie. One of the highlights of this movie, without a doubt, is the sound design. But in the beginning, it's hard to latch on to exactly what is going on. And that's not why I was confused about the movie or anything like that. But the reason I was confused about the movie at first is because I thought that this was basically an extended episode of Mission Impossible. The early style of this movie, Mission Impossible, the television show from the 60s, just to be clear. The early style in this film, with sort of jumping between different things, the look, the music, really evokes this Mission Impossible thing. Mission Impossible is absolutely a show where the whole point is to figure out about the sort of interesting harebrained scheme they're going to do. What will the twist be? What's the ploy? What's the caper? What's the game, right? You should absolutely try and predict, trying to see what's coming. That's the whole point. And so I started out this movie trying to figure out, well, what's going on here? And how can I fit this into my Excel spreadsheet of this movie? How can I predict the things that are going to happen and such? As I got a little bit farther into the movie, and like I said, the first time I watched it, I thought I was too tired to make sense of it. And even the second time, I thought, ooh, this is going to be a stretch. Am I really going to be able to keep all these details in my head? Am I really going to, what actually is going on here? It turns out, as you watch the movie a little bit more, you realize, oh, this is much more like something like Burning, or like a David Lynch film or something like that, where the virtues of the film are not a tricky plot, and where the plot, in fact, I think hardly matters at all. I'm not going to be discussing it in this review. I think it's, it's kind of worth sort of understanding what's going on, but doesn't really matter at all. This is indeed not like some episode of Mission Impossible. It's much more like some kind of intellectual film based around style and theme. So what is the content then? What is the point? What is the purpose of the movie? What is the theme and the style and such? Well, the most sort of obvious thing that comes forward in this movie is a conspicuous and disjointed modernity. This is all over the place, right? So you see interesting new makeup. You hear car commercials on the radar. You hear about the multiplex company that has a great big, really interesting building they're in, sort of generic, modern-looking building. You see the L.A. River, right? What a sort of cityscape the L.A. River is. It's takes the idea of a river, something profoundly natural, something profoundly cyclical, connected to the rhythms of the planet and the earth or something. And the LA River is basically the opposite of that. It's cement, it's man-made, it's a sewer more than anything. There's a phenomenal scene in this movie where kitchen appliances come to the forefront, almost seeming to be a direct parody, a direct critique, a direct something of like Walt Disney's Home of the Future and the appliances inside that or something like that. Materials are forward in this movie. This is a film that is in some ways fascinated with the materials of the modern world in the 1960s, like I said, with the commercials, with the commodities, with the things people are buying and selling, with the things people are saying, listening to, with the network, the economy that's flying through the air. This is kind of the thing that I think you should think about if you watch this movie. You should not think about, oh man, who was that guy? How do they know each other? But what's going to happen next? Don't bother, okay? Style and theme, those are the interesting things about this movie. This materialism is also gendered, and that's brought forward in this movie quite clearly. This movie is probably more focused on the masculine side of things, focusing on a business world and a criminal underworld. The role of masculinity in that, the struggle for a traditional masculinity in a new disjointed modern world, right? That's one of the main themes, without a doubt. So Lee Marvin, I'll tell you a tiny bit about the plot. Lee Marvin is some sort of crook, some sort of criminal. It's not really revealed exactly what his past is or anything like that, who had some kind of a business deal that turned sour and is seeking revenge. And as he seeks revenge, as he tries to get his money back, he finds himself sort of going down a rabbit hole of some shady corporate enterprise. He first tries to find the guy who rips him off, and then he tries to find that guy's boss. And as he goes further and further in, things become a little bit less certain about who people are, about what he might be able to find, the revenge he might be able to seek. And in this very basic plot, you can already see how we have this traditional masculinity and a new abstract, disjointed modern world defined by the multiplex company, right? Defined by these complex global industries that are hydras, beasts of many heads, hydras and hydraulic, right? So the movie starts out sort of, you realize, with Alcatraz. And in some ways it seems like Alcatraz is going to be kind of a central thing in this movie, and in some ways it is, metaphorically at least. Some of the scenes in the opening thing, it turns out, kind of take place at Alcatraz, and there's a very interesting scene where you hear the tour guide who's giving, it seems like a boat tour of Alcatraz, describing some of the history of it to certain tourists. And it seems like this is kind of setting the stage for some of the movie. Like it is describing things that go on at Alcatraz. It's describing escape attempts. It's describing the Battle of Alcatraz and such. And you think that we might be about to hit a flashback, and we might to see that Lee Marvin was involved in one of those things. But this is not the case. Instead, Alcatraz is more of a spiritual backdrop for the film. And this is interesting and such, because here, again, we see this sort of traditional underworld masculinity, the sort of a certain type of morality in the underworld, perhaps like a Western morality or something like that, that you might find the honor of gangs or something along those lines, is maybe attached to Alcatraz. But Alcatraz is closed now. And what is there in its place? Well, there's the Alcatraz Run, referred to many times in the film. And what's the Alcatraz Run? Well, it's not clear at all. It's some sort of shady underground thing, some sort of deal, some kind of a drop. Money changes hands. It's not clear if something else goes the other direction. It's never revealed. In place of the traditional morality of Alcatraz, right, where Alcatraz served both as a cornerstone of the justice system, being a prison, but also as a site for the anti-heroic gesture, right, for the escape attempt, right, for the romanticization of criminality. Alcatraz is a locus for that as well. That has been replaced by vague modern networks where there's an Alcatraz Run, a drop, something there, a helicopter coming in the middle of the night and giving some kind of a hand off. So again, we see this traditional masculinity in the face of sort of a new modern business model and a new modern culture. This is not just a commentary about the world. Well, how should I put this? This is, like most movies, a movie about movies. So in addition to maybe trying to make some overt statements about the appliances in our kitchens, about the distributed vagaries of the economy, things like that, this is also perhaps a commentary about film, right? So we see that there's a certain breakdown of the sort of some sort of traditional masculinity, right? Traditional masculine heroism or anti-heroism has broken down, has become listless, has become unanchored. Similarly, cinematic representations of that also have been, right? These things have been revealed to be somewhat superficial. These things have been, they're floating now. They're without anchor. And so just as Alcatraz, the prison, is gone, films about Alcatraz, earlier films about Alcatraz, although this was the first movie filmed at Alcatraz after it closed, actually. But you can see how this sort of corrodes in some extent. It puts an ironic wink at the end of movies made in the anti-heroic vein about these prison, the prison escape movies, the gangster films, things like that. These things are also being undermined. These things are also being fragmented and eroded by a certain type of modernity. Interesting. This is where we come back to the beginning of the movie. I said it was a disorienting movie. Partly that was just me sort of not setting out in the right mindset. I also don't really read anything about any of these movies before I watch them. So usually I can count on being able to think on my feet and figure out what's going on. In this case, it more or less worked out. But disorientation in the beginning of the movie is not a mistake. That's not a vice in this film. That is a virtue. That is another way of showing a certain kind of breakdown, a certain kind of disjointed nature, right? If this is a movie about movies, when we have a disorienting beginning, we are pulling at the logic of the film to some degree. We are pulling at the traditional exposition. We are putting stress on the audience and the grammar of the film in terms of how it's going to, in terms of the traditional expositional logic. Hopefully that makes sense. I feel like this review is maybe slightly more in the weeds, more abstract or something like that. Perhaps it's just because it's being recorded later at night than average. But point is, this disorienting things going on at the beginning serve a number of roles. One, to sort of allegorical representation of a new disoriented economy or something along those lines, and a disoriented culture or something like that, fragmented culture, right? Two, also to sort of be an allegory for how those things are pulling apart traditional modes of cinema, right? Putting stress on traditional logic of and grammar of film. So, cool. Like I said, if you set out thinking, hey, this is going to be a fun thriller, I think you're watching this movie just not the right way. I think you should adjust. there is one interesting thing that about this movie that occurred to me a number of times as I was watching it, which is that as sort of radical as this movie is in some ways, in terms of the style, for instance, I mentioned that the sound design is radical, but really, I mean, almost everything in this movie is pretty far out there in terms of style. If you were to compare this movie to a movie from 1957, they would be worlds apart. It's almost as if 10 years had passed between that and 1967, right? The changes in style were aggressive between those times. Obviously, we see the influence of European modernism, as in the New Wave, coming to the United States and such, which, by the way, this is a lot of the New Wave films deconstructing traditional masculinity through a new, listless, doomed criminality, right? That's kind of the modus operandi of a bunch of these movies, including something like Breathless is doing exactly that, basically. A certain revisionism of the noir or something like that. And I should mention, by the way, that what I eventually came to realize as I was watching this movie is that Mission Impossible is completely the wrong analog for this film. A much, much better analog is The Big Sleep, another movie that you should probably not try and pay attention to the plot of, another movie about masculinity and the economy and criminality, but showing things from the perspective of the 1940s. And this, showing us from the 1960s, gives a different story. But in a nutshell, this is basically a 60s version of The Big Sleep. And really, this movie is a noir. One thing, a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, not really a pet peeve, yeah, that's not the right word at all, but one thing that's kind of interesting is that often noir as a genre is defined almost entirely by style, right? It's a noir if it's filmed in black and white. Forget about Chinatown, I guess. If it's got certain type of music, certain type of, it's got to be rainy. We've got to have Dutch angles. We've got to have big shadows and such. It's got to be, expressionistic. And people sometimes overlook some of the content of, or some of the thematic ideas of noir, right? The very particular view of masculinity and such, the perhaps resentment or something like that. But more than anything, the fatalism of the genre, right? And if you discount the style of noir and you look at these thematic things, you'll realize pretty quickly that this movie is a noir, basically, right? It's got the fatalist thing. It's got this sort of masculinity thing going on. Thematically, this is a noir film. Okay. Good tangent there, I think. Hopefully those were interesting things. I would be sad if I hadn't gotten those across. But what I was saying beforehand is that despite this seeming like a really radical movie, right? There were a lot of movies that were pretty different coming out in the 60s in terms of style. But this certainly, if you would have seen it in theaters in the 60s, you would have thought, yep, this movie is really trying to push the envelope here in terms of seeming new and different. For all of that, there's one sort of interesting absence, which is any direct reference to subversives or some kind of subversive lifestyle or anything like that. So this is not a movie, something like Zabriskie Point, Easy Rider, Medium Cool, movies that I maybe, any of these 60s movies that I mentioned in last week's video about Soldier Blue or whatever. This is not a movie that's going to be overtly political or that is going to feature any kind of subversive characters, right? You won't see any hippies in this movie or anything. Lee Marvin is an older character. He is playing a sort of a grizzled old school criminal or something like that. He's not a flower child by any means, right? So this movie, despite being kind of a radical 60s movie that is in some ways attacking certain things about modernity and certain things about the economy and such, it does not fall into the category that most movies that do that in this era do, of sort of positioning that against some kind of subversive hippie back to the land kind of movement. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I quite like those movies. But it's kind of interesting tailspin on this. And that's one of the things that, like I said, this is not an overtly political movie. And I think that is kind of a strength in some ways, because a lot of the movies that come from this time are all about politics, which, like I said, I really like some of these movies. Sometimes it's a bit hokey and overplayed. Again, see the review on Soldier Blue for more thoughts on this. But like I said, this is not a political movie, and that makes it somewhat unique in that time period. Like I said, no subversives. Instead, you get Lee Marvin, this emblem of a certain type of traditional masculinity, criminality, economy, and anti-heroism, setting out on a mission that may end up being like trying to grasp sand in your hand and having it slip through your fingers. Trying to grab at something that ends up being remarkably diffuse when he sets out his vengeance towards this big economic machine. So, like I said, I feel like maybe this review is like way more abstract than usual, but I think that it captures my thoughts about this movie. Definitely an interesting movie, much more of an intellectual movie than I had expected. Cool movie, great style, great vibes, some good acting. I guess it's not like this is a realistic movie or anything like that, but solid, interesting, memorable characters, pretty good music, really good sound design, nice music. Overall, totally worth checking out this movie Point Blank from 1967.